Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about tensions in Ladakh that continue to define a new low in India-China relations. Despite a 5-point agreement penned in Moscow last week between the foreign ministers of China and India, there's no let-up at the amorphous line that separates Chinese and Indian troops. China already has a developed military ecosystem in the area. India is fast-tracking the requirements for sustaining and maintaining additional troops, estimated at 25 to 30,000 personnel. Reported capital and operational costs of this hard deployment have been estimated at rupees 1 billion per day. This at a time when India's economy is tanking because of a pre-COVID slowdown as well as the toll taken by COVID-19. And these estimates are being put out by the Indians themselves. Indian officials say they are witnessing Chinese laying optical fiber cables in the Pangong Tso sector for fast and secure communication between rear headquarters and forward deployed troops. Winter is approaching, and according to Indian analysts, Delhi is buying expensive Arctic gear for troops that cannot now be pulled back during the harsh weather. The 5-point agreement has effectively laid to rest the idea of a line of actual control, substituting it with the term border areas. The 5 points are reminiscent of Panchsheel Treaty signed in April 1954 in then Peking. To discuss the situation, let's get to our panel of experts. We are joined by Sameer Lalwani, Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program at Stimson Center, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. Thank you to both panelists here. Let me begin with Sameer here. Sameer, this particular agreement seems to have averted any immediate conflict. But to me, it seems that there is so much of uncertainty about the mechanisms that it could have laid the foundation for a bigger conflict.
I think that's right, Ejaz. Currently, I think we're at a temporary pause, which has happened over the last few months several times. But there's still mobilization taking place. There's still high levels of readiness and preparations, fortifications that are going to be enduring rather than temporary. And so I would say tactically there's a pause, but strategically we're in the midst of a pretty deep competition that's about to emerge.
Absolutely. Now, as I said, in terms of the cost, this is now no more the line of actual control, which ironically, as you might recall, was a term that was used by the Chinese premier, Chairman Lai, and was rejected by then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, but of course popped up in the 1993 agreement. So this term is also now gone, and the 5-point agreement talks about border areas. Now, given the fact that nothing is demarcated and delineated on any map, this particular term throws up its own problems.
Yeah, I think it means that you can't rely on agreements or designations that were mutually accepted or mutual restraints. Everything's going to be competitive. Everything's going to be contested. Even sectors, for example, that India believes to be its own, it now has to occupy or believes it has to occupy at times in order to preempt the possibility of future fait accomplis. And the Chinese might feel the same. So what it does is it probably, as you said, stresses militaries. It requires them to sort of be at a high operational level, high alert status, expend resources, support logistics. And it's very manpower intensive, mountainous terrain. So it's going to be demanding on both sides. Obviously, the Indian economy is less capable, or maybe it'll stress the Indian economy more. I think it's capable of handling it, but that's probably not where India would like to spend its resources given the current economic status and getting itself out of a COVID slump.
Right. Let me pull in Kamran Bokhari here. Kamran, Sameer is making this point, which is interesting, and I agree with him, in the sense that there is a lot of potential here for both sides to try and go into areas, capture heights, where there's no presence of the other side, in order to have some kind of, better defensive line. This could then lead to some kind of horizontal escalation, not just in the Ladakh sector, but could possibly also in the middle and the eastern sectors.
Absolutely, Ejaz. One of the problems with the situation right now is that both sides assume that the other side will do something unexpected. And when you have that kind of situation, it's very easy to escalate. And there, on one hand, you see these political level talks trying to sort of paper over the conflict, maintain it, as Samir was, put a set a pause button, as Samir was mentioning. But I think that at the same time, they both know that given the opportunity, the other side will move. And it may not be restricted to the LAC. I think it was like yesterday or the day before, the Times of India actually identified 27 flashpoints, potential flashpoints that extend from Arunachal Pradesh all the way to Kashmir. So, the Indians and the Chinese are looking at a large battle box, if you will, or a battle space.
Now, before we proceed further, a couple of things that I want to, and I have the 5 points in front of me. The second point talks about the two foreign ministers agreeing that the border troops of both sides should continue their dialogue. So this was one thing. Secondly, maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas and avoid any action that could escalate matters. And then, through the special representative mechanism on the India-China boundary question, and also the working mechanism for consultation and coordination. Now, it's very interesting, Kamran, that when this meeting was, everyone was waiting for this meeting. It started slightly late. It went on much longer than was expected. And up until midnight, there wasn't any word about what had actually, come out of this until the press release with these 5 points. But the sense was that somehow this particular meeting will be able to resolve some of the outstanding issues. But all it did was to throw it back to the ground troops, to the special representative, and to the WMCC. So, to me, it was a lot of diplomacies in favor of China and perhaps against India.
Yeah, I mean, the situation is Chinese moved first. So that set the ball rolling. And so the Indians are reacting. It's going to be an uphill battle for the Indians to level the terms of engagement without the fear of escalation that we just talked about. So, yes, diplomatically, there are niceties. Press releases are issued to sort of tell the public, okay, this is what we're doing, but not exactly, because there are a lot of things that are not covered. And a lot of things, as you said, are deferred down to, the lower levels, the operational level, the military guys, and the other working committees. So this is sort of kicking the can down the road. This is sort of saying, okay, we don't want to have a flare-up that's uncontrollable, but we both know that this isn't ending here. And look, the Chinese didn't get involved in this just for the heck of it, if you will. Yeah. They seriously invested in this, and if you look at their movements, this isn't like a border skirmish. This seems like they're putting down roots and for the long haul.
Absolutely, and theater-wide, and since the Doklam crisis, they've been building up the habitat. Samir, this, as I said, is no more an issue of border management. This is now perhaps harder, the LAC, perhaps harder than the LOC, although I'll not make the comparison because the terrain is different, the trajectories are different, and the lines are different. So India is now looking at maintaining troops, sustaining them there, and that requires a cost, and that also requires a certain kind of, resolve. Do you think that, because the PLA what we have seen since May is that it has physically dominated nodal points. It also psychologically dominates the area. And now it seems to me that any Indian move that tries to somehow extricate the Indian troops from that psychological dominance is something that the PLA will be hard-pressed to accept, which to me then the corollary of that would be the possibility, a greater possibility of a riposte and therefore a broader conflict.
So I think you said a lot of things there, Ejaz. I would take them. Let me take them piece by piece.
Correct.
On psychological dominance, I think that that's sort of in the eye of the beholder and it's the eye of each army or military. But I think the Indians are not without options here. There may not be sort of ideal options, but they can sort of accept where the Chinese are in terms of a limited fait accompli and yet deny sort of further incursions and fortify their border. And simultaneous to this, when we're talking about the agreement where the Chinese said to avoid any actions, the Indians can continue to build up infrastructure, right? Their biggest vulnerability has been mobility and communications, transportation on their side of the LAC. And so if there's a pause, the pause can also enable the Indians to continue their buildup of, enhancement of roads and logistics. So I'm not sure what direction sort of that psychological advantage goes. On the other hand, you're seeing the Indians getting a lot of support from the Americans. There's been a series of discussions and agreements taking place. A lot of it is on paper, but it enables the possibility for actual material cooperation, and some of that is starting to take place too. So that could sort of provide some psychological succor to the Indians. But I think, your larger point is this is going to tie down a lot of forces for an extended period of time. The choreography of competition on the LAC is not as well thought through or experienced as on the LOC. And so you're going to have a lot of flare-ups and accidents and miscalculations because the meaning of movements and, riposts and sort of activity on the LAC is not as clearly understood by either side. There hasn't been as 30 years of engagement and dialogue and, observation. So I think it's going to be contested for a period of time, and it's going to be dangerous, more so than it has been for decades. And that can absorb resources on both sides, on the Indian side, but also on the Chinese side. This is a secondary theater for the PLA. Their primary area of concern is the eastern seaboard. And so what I think we'll all be observing is what is the ratio of forces that are sort of tied down to the LAC in this. And it's possible that it favors the Chinese, but it's also possible the inverse.
I think a couple of points. The Chinese, since 2017, have been developing a military ecosystem there. And they've been training there in the area, so their troops don't have to go through acclimatization and the rest of it. And they already have a very good communication, lines of communication from their rear headquarters right up to their forward locations. But the psychological dominance point that I was making is frankly, Samir, very clear to me with reference to now I think there have been hundreds of analyses that have come out of India with reference to this crisis. And one thing is very clear, if you leave aside some of the bluster, one can see very clearly that that India and also the Indian Army has been worried about the consequences of an actual shooting war. And I think that is something that reflects on the psychological sort of dominance part of this. And as you know, psychological dominance is in some cases even more important than physical dominance. But you talked about the communication infrastructure. I want you to just take a look at the mental map of the area and give me a sense of, for instance, one of the vulnerable points is where the Chinese, and this happened also in 2013, is the Depsang plains and the Daulat Beg Uldai advanced landing ground, which is crucial for, as a line of communication, fast movement of troops and equipment for the Indian Army. So, and that's a vulnerable point. So give me your sense of that.
Yeah, you're right. I think there are several vulnerabilities there. The question is, can the Indians deny sort of a first advance of Chinese troops, or do they have to escalate or respond sort of in another sector for a bargaining position of some sort? I think now the element of surprise has been removed, right? So if the Chinese were really going to exploit those vulnerabilities, they could have done them several months ago. They can still do them now, but at a much, much higher cost. So right now, the absence of the element of surprise means that, I think the Indians have a pretty decent defensive position for the moment. The question then is the peacetime stress that it'll cause on the military, the readiness levels that are sort of, and alert levels that are required, as you talked about, the expenditures that are required. You're burning up, certainly sort of the use of mechanized forces and potentially, energy, oil expenditures for the ability to continue mobilization and movement and transport. So I think that'll be a greater stress. This probably then requires the Indians to think more seriously about investments in technology that will be, higher costs on the front end, but in the long run be more effective. So more advanced ground sensors and remote sensors, the ability to rely on technology as opposed to just simple manpower, cheap robotics and drones for ISR and surveillance. There are a lot of investments that I think the Indians have been thinking about for a long time, but have been never sufficiently motivated to get going or in insufficient numbers.
It's interesting, Samir, it's interesting you mentioned this because General Rawat, when he was the army chief, he talked about force reconfiguration, making it more tech-intensive rather than labor-intensive. But with this particular crisis, the general sort of consensus that's emerging in Delhi among the analysts, including former military officers, is that India will have to sort of postpone, if you will, this whole idea of cutting down on personnel numbers, while at the same time trying to do what you mentioned in terms of manning the border, the smart sort of manning. So that would then have its additional cost. So just give me a quick sense of whether you would agree with that.
I think it's a mixed bag here. So I disagree with the idea that it puts on hold all technology investments. I think it's the type of investments that we're talking about, right? So I think the Indian military, when it thinks about the trade-offs between manpower versus technology, is thinking about large-scale platforms, carriers, fighter jets, sort of these advanced complex systems. And what I'm saying is that those might also have to be put on hold, but most likely the investments that are necessary are cheaper, smaller, and more numerous distributed lethality assets, right? Drones, missiles, sensors. Those are the kinds of things that'll be more useful because they're more expendable. They're less costly in sort of single numbers. You can distribute them over a wider front. So that, in my mind, I don't think they can escape the fact that they are a bloated military and they have to cut down on manpower. A lot of that manpower is not being used in, men under arms, but rather in sort of secondary or support functions, and those things can be either automated or outsourced in some way. So I think they recognize that. The question, though, is whether they're going to sort of make this harder choice, which I think all militaries, including the United States, are struggling with, is do you get away from the expensive legacy platforms that are appealing to large military organizations, but highly they're vulnerable and much more vulnerable, and you sink a lot of costs into them rather than smaller, lighter, and more numerous distributed assets.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Sameer Lalwani speaking with us. Kamran, let me take the discussion forward with reference to capabilities. So far, what we have witnessed is basic infantry movement, infantry assaults, whether by the PLA or by India. But there is, as we move up, the differential between capabilities begins to increase exponentially at the top end. So give me your sense of that differential between Chinese capabilities and Indian capabilities, and how could that impact the results of any further conflict?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at capabilities, you look at hardware, and you can see that the Chinese have a lot, rely on themselves to a great extent. The Indians have a variety of platforms from France, from Russia, from the United States, from Britain, indigenously developed systems as well. But overall, being a bigger economy, the Chinese obviously have far greater capabilities. They can field more men in the old-fashioned style of doing things, and they're technologically advanced. I mean, this isn't some secret. This is well known. But I think that we need to sort of overlay that reality of capabilities into, the theater, if you will. And what do I mean by that is that, yes, the Chinese are playing. This is just one area along its periphery that the Chinese are playing in. They have, the South China Sea. They have the Eastern Seaboard that Sameer was talking about, and of course now Ladakh. And with India, there are three different arenas. There's the Sikkim area. There is the Arunachal Pradesh area in the northeast, and then we have this one in Kashmir. Now, from the Indian point of view, let's just come back to Kashmir and the LAC. The Chinese only have to deploy on one front, whereas the Indians have to deploy and divvy up resources between the LOC and the LAC. And then, of course, there's the intelligence capability aspect, is how much of penetration do you have on what the other side is doing in terms on the ground. I mean, not at a higher level, but tactically, what are the Indian troop movements and whatnot, and what are the Chinese? Now here, if things get serious, you can expect the Indians to get American assistance in terms of intel sharing. The Chinese are already aware of that, and therefore one has to assume that they're operating under that assumption that at some point, if this thing escalates, then the Americans will come into the picture, albeit behind the scenes. So there's a variety of capabilities that one has to look at.
Right. Kamran, stay with me. I'm also joined by Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Michael, thank you for your time. I think you've listened in on some of the discussions here. My question to you is that, when it started, frankly, no one really thought that this was a tier one issue for China. As Kamran said, and Sameer earlier said, that the Eastern Seaboard is very important for China. But it seems to me that now this particular tension or standoff has acquired greater significance for Beijing if we also factor the US in, and if we factor in the Quad issue, the sort of desire or objective, I would say, for Beijing to humiliate India, becomes very important in terms of essentially benchmarking the pecking order in Asia.
No, I think that you're right, Ejaz. As you well know, these border spats between India and China are not unusual, and there have been a number of them that have taken place since the war they fought in the early 1960s. But this one has been different for obvious reasons. It's been longer, tenser, and more violent than these tend to be. And I think that the U.S. angle is very important to highlight here. Certainly, we should be looking at this crisis and how it's played out against the backdrop of an increasingly toxic rivalry between the United States and China. And if you're looking for reasons that could account for Beijing's decision to act in the way that it has along the LAC, and particularly muscular ways, more so than you typically get in these border spats with India, certainly you have to look at this U.S.-India-China triangle, where over the last few months, the U.S.-China rivalry has really intensified, even as the U.S.-India relationship has gotten better and better, in great part because of a shared concern about China's increasing influence and power in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And in that regard, I think that we could see, at least in part, the way in which Beijing has been acting here along the border as an attempt to send a tough message to both India and the United States. In effect, saying something to the effect that, well, if you two are going to work together, increase your security relations because of concerns about us, well, we'll show you what we can do. So not to say that there are not other reasons for why the crisis has played out in the way that it has now, and we've discussed many of these reasons on your show before, but I do think that this increasingly toxic U.S.-China rivalry is a big part of what's playing out, and indeed will make it difficult to expect this crisis to wind down anytime soon, even with this agreement that was recently concluded between the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers.
Absolutely. Michael, quickly, I'm also running out of time. What was dubbed as Kennedy's Forgotten War by Bruce Rydell, do you think that in the event of a broader conflict, horizontal escalation in the Ladakh sector, or possibly the middle sector, the eastern sector, what role would the U.S. play? And I'm assuming here that the U.S. role would be, or response would be, similar regardless of whether President Trump comes back or whether Joe Biden becomes the president.
Well, I mean, as my friend Kamran mentioned before, I think that the U.S. would not hesitate to provide more of the intelligence support that it already has provided to India, I imagine, in this dispute. And the U.S., as I understand it, had also provided some intelligence support to India during the Doklam dispute 3 years back. I do not think we should overstate the role that the U.S. would play in the event of more escalation or a crisis between the two countries. We could talk so much about how the U.S.-India security relationship has grown over the years, but it is nothing closely approximating a security alliance, and there's no obligation on the part of the United States to come to India's aid if it faces military force from China or any other rival. The U.S.-India relationship is very different from Washington's relationships with its treaty allies in Japan and South Korea, or with its NATO partners for that matter. It's a very different thing. But I don't necessarily think that India would expect or even want all that much much of a U.S. response, so long as the crisis or a conflict remains fairly low grade. I think that India understands that the relationship between the two is such that it would be very unlikely for the U.S. to actually get involved. So clearly, I think that Washington hopes that things wind down sooner rather than later. Certainly, the U.S. gets some useful political value out of saying, well, look, here's China being the bully, here's China being the aggressor. This is why the world has to work together to push back against China.
Yeah,
but at the end of the day,
that's the kind of thing that's already coming out of, in some ways, out of the Beltway. But let me quickly go back to Kamran here. Kamran, my own sense is that the Chinese are looking at a long-term play here, essentially attrition. attrition at multiple levels. But give me quickly, because I have almost run out of time, your sense of your projection of, let's say, another month, 2 months, 3 months. What is likely to happen?
I think it depends on what the Chinese want, and I think that the Chinese want two things. One, strategically, and that's something that Michael eloquently put, is sending that message that, look, if you guys are going to tag team against us, here's a sample of what we can do in response. So it's messaging to the United States. Strategically, that's what the Chinese want. And so in many ways, that's already been established. Now, tactically is where the picture gets more complicated, because in order to achieve the strategic objective, there's a tactical cost. And that cost can't be contained as one would want. So the Chinese need to make sure that the gains they have made, that they keep them. And ideally, they can keep pushing this envelope. So at this stage, it's difficult to say, what will happen. But I can tell you that the Chinese are not going to pull back. If anything, they're waiting for what the Indians can do besides coming to the negotiating table. What can they demonstrate on the battle space? I think the ball is still very much in India's court. And I think that we just have to wait and see. I'd be watching more so the Indians than the Chinese.
Right. I totally agree with you. But thank you so much, Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Thank you, Michael Kugelman, for your insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss a walkout by India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, from a virtual NSA meet of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about the behavior of India's National Security Advisor at the SCO's virtual meeting of the National Security Advisors of member states. On Tuesday, Ajit Doval walked out of the meeting when Pakistan's National Security Advisor, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, began to speak. Earlier, India had objected to Pakistan's new map displayed in the conference room. Doval also boycotted the speech by the Russian National Security Advisor. To get more details of what happened and why, we have with us Dr. Moeed Yusuf, so we'll straight to him to get details of what happened. Moeed, thank you for being with us. Before I ask anything else, let me begin with a relatively more juicy bit. What exactly made the Indian NSA leave the meeting?
Well, again, of course I don't know. I'll just tell you what happened. Basically, we had a test call because this was a virtual session, so the Russians requested all countries to come together on a test call to make sure the technology was right and the internet speed and all of that. When we did that, and I of course wasn't present, it was the technical teams who did that. The room that we use for such state speeches and events has a map in the background, a new map. The Indians proceeded to formally object through a note verbal to the Russians, saying that Pakistan's put this map up, we don't accept this map, Kashmir is shown as Pakistan, etc., etc. In fairly, strong language. This was the 11th. The Russians got to us on the 14th, essentially just communicating to everybody what the Indians had done, which is standard protocol. This was the night before the speech. And so we had a very brief internal consultation and we decided there is absolutely no question. And I made myself clear, quite frankly, if there's going to be a speech, there's going to be a map. India is not going to be dictating, or nobody's going to be dictating, quite frankly, what's put on my office's wall when I speak. This is the Prime Minister's office and we decide. So we proceeded to let the Russians know in writing in very clear terms. When we did that, we went to the meeting. Mr. Doval was there. It was alphabetical order, and so he spoke before me. When I started speaking, he got up and left. I actually, to be very honest, did not notice because I was speaking, and this was on the screen. I didn't see him leaving. But once I was done, my colleagues told me were there. Told me that he'd actually walked out and boycotted. Quite frankly, I was surprised. I thought it was settled, but the most surprising part was he never returned for the Russian speech. Came back, I think, like at the very tail end or whatever. But India essentially boycotted the Pakistani and Russian speech, and then he got up and left again, and they boycotted, I believe, the Uzbekistan speech as well. Yeah, I think it was Uzbekistan. So, you know, you make what you want to make of it. As far as I'm concerned, it's a clear snub, quite frankly, to the Russians, to the SCO. What may be behind it, you know, the Indians would be able to explain better. Very unfortunate for a forum that's built around cooperation, and even more unfortunate, quite frankly, because this is exactly what we've been telling the world about this India and where it's going and what its attitude towards global norms and laws is.
Very interesting that the map got under Mr. Dowell's skin this way. I say this because the day this map was unveiled, there was much negative comment about it. Opposition leaders, social media users made sarcastic comments about the entire exercise. But Dowell's reaction shows how and why maps are important. I really want you to comment on both aspects, the criticism and Dowell's reaction.
Yes, that's true. I mean, there was, I think, tongue-in-cheek kind of critique. If I remember correctly, you also had this view. But, you know, we thought long and hard about this. All relevant sort of ministries, colleagues, stakeholders spent hours and hours doing this. And, you know, a lot of other colleagues actually deserve more credit on this than me. I want to be clear about this. And ultimately, this map was necessary not only because India had published a map, but it reflects our legal right on Kashmir, which had become important after 5th August 2019, to reiterate that. Also the wishes of Pakistan and the Kashmiri people. So I think it was a consensus decision. Yes, one can say, well, you know, put out a map, how does this solve the Kashmir problem? But I'll tell you, now I can say this. We knew from day one that it was getting under India's skin. We knew that this was going to be a major issue for them. And, you know, thankfully, Allah has been kind. We saw the evidence yesterday, and this is just one public evidence. Quite frankly, there's much more, and we know that this has bothered them a lot, because it started the real debate again. That Pakistan put out a map that clearly says UNSC resolutions as the final settlement, clearly says Jammu and Kashmir is, erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir is disputed. We show IIOJK as disputed. And then there's an Indian map, which quite frankly you'd find in a comic book, if at all, where you've drawn lines to say all of northern Pakistan somehow becomes your part, and you're a neighbor to Afghanistan. You know, and they can't put that map up anywhere because it'd be laughed at. So this has created a problem. But again, you know, let me be very candid on this. I am not bothered by internal critique. Look, what India wants to do is create divisions within Pakistan on the Kashmir issue, and Kashmir must remain above all politics. So if people are critiquing, that's fine. It's Pakistanis, you know, giving a view on a government action. We will take that in our stride. We should learn from criticism. We're completely open to that. As long as it's clear, this is Pakistan, we do debate things. Ultimately, Kashmir is not a political issue, it is a national issue.
Well, Moeed, before I ask you the final question, I want to put the record straight with reference to the comment that you had about my view. In fact, just a reminder, I was the one who wrote a detailed op-ed explaining every single detail of the new map and why it was important to put out a new map. But anyway, given Dowell's reaction, what prospects do you see for any possible Pakistan-India normalization anytime in the near to the far future?
We have a very clear stance on this. You reverse 5th of August 2019, we are open to seeing where we go from there. Why? Because fundamentally, we stand for peace in the region, we stand for stability, and our focus and goal is economic security, economic diplomacy, geo-economics, and connectivity. Why can't we do that? Well, you know what the eastern neighbor is up to. We are trying very hard to get peace in Afghanistan. Why? Because we can get access to Central Asia and connectivity. CPEC, why? Because it's north-south connectivity. So Pakistan's entire focus is now economic security, economy, connectivity. Yes, we have problems internally. Our economy needs to be much stronger, and that work is a work in progress, of course. But the east-west part cannot work till Kashmir is resolved, and international law is the only body which tells you where to go on these kind of disputes, and the UN resolutions are there. So till then, quite frankly, normalization out of the question. If India understands, realizes, which it's a matter of time, I'm sure it's a matter of time, they will have to reverse, and then we can see where the conversation will go. Short of that, there's no question at all.
Well, thank you. That was Dr. Moeed Yusuf speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.